The Senate Judiciary Committee that day hosted representatives of two different Americas. On one side was Kash Patel, the controversial DOJ official from the Trump era, advocate of deep state theories, the man who dreamed of fundamentally transforming federal institutions. On the other side was Jasmine Crockett, new generation Democrat, former prosecutor, a woman who believed in reform from within the system. The clash between them wasn't just political. It was a fundamental war about how justice would function in America's future. And what happened that day would show which vision was stronger. The Hart Senate office building felt different on that cold February morning. Room 216, normally a place of routine oversight hearings, hummed with an undercurrent of anticipation that had drawn reporters from every major news organization in Washington. The Senate Judiciary Committee had called a hearing on intelligence community oversight and accountability. But everyone knew what this was really about: the ongoing battle over the so-called weaponization of federal law enforcement agencies. At the witness table sat Kash Patel, former NSC staffer, former Pentagon chief of staff, and one of the most controversial figures to emerge from the Trump administration. At 44, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had operated at the highest levels of government and wasn't intimidated by congressional interrogation. Across from him, arranged in the familiar horseshoe formation, sat the members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. The Republican side was friendly territory. They had requested this hearing and invited Patel to testify about what they termed the politicization of federal agencies. But the Democratic side was a different story entirely. Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas sat in the second row of the Democratic side, having been specially invited to participate in this hearing due to her background as a former prosecutor and her work on intelligence oversight. At 43, she brought a prosecutor's mentality to every hearing, methodical, prepared, and deadly when she found inconsistencies. Committee Chairman Lindsey Graham called the hearing to order at 10 a.m. sharp. Today we examine serious allegations about the politicization of our intelligence agencies, Graham announced, his South Carolina drawl carrying the weight of someone who had chaired hearings for decades. Mr. Patel, you served in multiple capacities during the Trump administration, including as Senior Director for Counterterrorism at the National Security Council. You've alleged that federal agencies were weaponized against the Trump administration. We're here today to examine those allegations. Patel leaned into his microphone, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had briefed presidents. Thank you, Chairman Graham. What I witnessed during my time in government was unprecedented. Federal agencies being used as political weapons against a sitting president, his associates, and ultimately against the American people. It was a strong opening, delivered with the kind of insider gravitas that usually silenced critics. The deep state isn't a conspiracy theory, Patel continued, using the term that had made him famous in conservative circles. It's a collection of unelected bureaucrats who believe they know better than the American voters. They undermined President Trump from day one, and they continue to undermine anyone who threatens their power. Republican senators nodded approvingly. This was the narrative they had invited him to present. But Crockett sat quietly, taking notes, waiting for her turn. The first hour proceeded predictably. Republican senators asked sympathetic questions that allowed Patel to elaborate on his theories about bureaucratic resistance, illegal surveillance, and politically motivated investigations. Senator Ted Cruz of Texas led the friendly questioning. Mr. Patel, based on your experience at NSC, can you explain how these agencies operate outside normal oversight? Patel was in his element. Senator, what I saw was a pattern of agencies withholding information from the White House, slow-walking legitimate policy directives, and in some cases, actively working to undermine presidential decisions. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had been in the room where decisions were made. The FBI, the CIA, elements within DOJ, they operated as if they were accountable to no one. They had their own agenda, and anyone who questioned that agenda was labeled a threat to democracy. Democratic senators tried to push back, but Patel had years of experience deflecting hostile questions. He had talking points for every accusation, anecdotes for every criticism. But at 11:30 a.m., Chairman Graham called on Representative Crockett for her questioning period. Crockett looked up from her notes, her expression neutral but focused. "Thank you, Chairman Graham. Mr. Patel, I appreciate your testimony today. I'd like to start with some specifics about your role at the National Security Council." Patel nodded confidently. "Of course, Representative. You served as Senior Director for Counterterrorism from February 2019 to February 2020, correct?" "That's correct." "And in that role, you had access to classified intelligence regarding terrorist threats to the United States?" "Yes, that was my responsibility." Crockett consulted her notes. "Mr. Patel, during your tenure, there were several high-profile terrorist incidents. The October 2019 ISIS attack in Syria that killed 2 SDF fighters, the December 2019 Naval Air Station Pensacola shooting, and the January 2020 intelligence warnings about Iranian retaliation after the Soleimani strike." Patel shifted slightly. These weren't the questions he had expected. "I'm familiar with those incidents, yes." "Good. Now, Mr. Patel, you've testified today that intelligence agencies were weaponized and operating outside proper oversight. During your time as the person responsible for counterterrorism policy coordination, did you ever report these concerns to your superiors?" The question was simple, but Patel seemed to sense danger. "Representative, my concerns were more about domestic political surveillance than counterterrorism operations." "I see," Crockett said, making a note. "But you were in a position to observe how these agencies operated on a daily basis, correct? You attended intelligence briefings, coordinated with FBI counterterrorism units, worked with CIA analysts." "That's correct." "And during this year of close collaboration with intelligence professionals, you observed evidence of the deep state conspiracy you've described today." Patel's confidence flickered for just a moment. "Representative, the issues I've identified weren't necessarily visible in day-to-day counterterrorism work." "Really?" Crockett's eyebrows raised slightly. "Because in your book, Government Gangsters, you write that the deep state operates at every level of government and infects every agency." That's a quote from page 47. She held up a copy of Patel's book. "But now you're telling us that during a full year in one of the most sensitive positions in government, working daily with intelligence professionals, you didn't observe evidence of this systemic corruption." Patel looked uncomfortable for the first time. "Representative, the problems were more subtle than that." "Subtle," Crockett repeated. "Mr. Patel, you've made a career out of alleging massive corruption in federal agencies. You've written books about it, given speeches about it, appeared on countless television shows about it. But when you were in a position to document this corruption, to report it through proper channels, to address it as a senior government official, you saw nothing worth reporting?" The chamber was quieter now. Even Republican senators seemed to be paying closer attention. Patel tried to regain his footing. "Representative, the surveillance abuses and political targeting I've documented were primarily focused on—" "Let's talk about surveillance," Crockett interrupted smoothly. "In your book, you claim that intelligence agencies conducted illegal surveillance on American citizens for political purposes. As Senior Director for Counterterrorism, you had oversight responsibilities for surveillance programs under Executive Order 12333, correct?" "Some aspects, yes." "And during your tenure, did you ever document instances of illegal surveillance? Did you file complaints with the Inspector General? Did you report violations to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court?" Patel was clearly struggling now. "Representative, my role was focused on policy coordination." "Your role," Crockett said, consulting another document, "according to the NSC organizational chart from your tenure, included ensuring compliance with legal and oversight requirements for counterterrorism activities." That's from the White House website, archived during your time in office. She looked up at him. "So I'll ask again. During your year overseeing counterterrorism surveillance programs, did you document any instances of the illegal surveillance you now claim was rampant?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. Representative, the issues I've identified were complex and not always visible through normal oversight channels. Crockett nodded slowly. I see. So the massive surveillance conspiracy you've built a career describing was invisible to you when you were responsible for preventing exactly that kind of abuse. She flipped to another page in her notes. Mr. Patel, let's discuss another claim from your testimony. You stated that agencies withheld information from the White House and slow-walked legitimate policy directives. Can you provide specific examples from your time at NSC? Patel looked like he was beginning to realize this wasn't going to be the friendly questioning he'd expected from previous congressional appearances. Representative, there were instances where agencies were not fully responsive to presidential priorities. Instances, Crockett repeated. Can you name one? Just one specific example where an agency withheld information from you or slow-walked a directive you were responsible for implementing? Patel hesitated. There were broader patterns that were concerning. Mr. Patel, with respect, you're under oath. You've made specific allegations about specific misconduct. I'm asking for one specific example from your personal experience. The chamber was dead silent now. Reporters were typing furiously. Representative, I'd prefer not to get into classified details in an open hearing. Crockett smiled slightly. Mr. Patel, I'm not asking for classified details. I'm asking for the basic facts of one instance where you personally experienced the agency misconduct you've described. The existence of such an incident isn't classified, even if the details might be. She leaned forward. Surely if this corruption was as widespread as you claim, you can give us one example without revealing classified information. Patel was visibly sweating now. Representative, these issues were complex and involved patterns of behavior rather than single incidents. Patterns of behavior that you observed personally? Yes. But you can't describe a single instance of this behavior. Not without potentially revealing classified information. Crockett consulted her notes again. Mr. Patel, I have here a copy of your financial disclosure forms from your time at NSC. After leaving government, you wrote a book, started a consulting business, and began making paid speeches about deep state corruption. How much money have you made from these activities? Republican senators started to object, but Crockett held up her hand. This goes to the witness's credibility, Mr. Chairman. If Mr. Patel has financial incentives to promote these theories, that's relevant to his testimony. She looked back at Patel. According to your book deal disclosure, you received a $2.5 million advance. Your speaking fees average $75,000 per appearance. Your consulting firm charges $50,000 per month for clients seeking to navigate the deep state. Is that accurate? Patel's voice was barely audible. Those figures are approximately correct. So you've made millions of dollars promoting theories about deep state corruption, but when you were in a position to document and address that corruption as a government official, you took no action? The attack was devastating in its simplicity. Crockett wasn't finished. Mr. Patel, let's discuss your claims about the FBI. You've alleged that the Bureau was weaponized against President Trump. During your time at NSC, how many FBI counterterrorism briefings did you attend? Dozens, I'm sure. And in those briefings, did you observe evidence of political bias or unprofessional conduct? Not in those specific briefings, no. How many FBI agents did you work with directly in your counterterrorism role? Many. I couldn't give you an exact number. Would you say it was more than 50? Probably. And how many of these agents displayed the political bias you now claim is endemic to the Bureau? Patel looked trapped. Representative, my concerns about the FBI weren't based on my counterterrorism work. I understand, Crockett said. But you worked closely with FBI professionals for a year. These were agents risking their lives to protect Americans from terrorist threats. Did they strike you as corrupt deep state operatives or as dedicated law enforcement professionals? They were dedicated professionals. All of them? Yes. So the FBI agents you worked with personally were dedicated professionals, but the FBI as an institution is corrupt. Patel had no good answer for that. Crockett moved to her final line of attack. Mr. Patel, you've made serious allegations today about federal agencies. You've accused career civil servants of betraying their oaths, engaging in illegal surveillance, and undermining democracy. These are grave charges. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. But when you were in a position to document these crimes, you documented nothing. When you could have reported these violations, you reported nothing. When you could have fixed these problems as a senior official, you did nothing. Her voice grew stronger. Instead, you waited until you left government, waited until you had a book deal and speaking contracts, and then you made millions of dollars selling these theories to the public. Patel looked like he wanted to disappear. So I have to ask, Mr. Patel, are these allegations based on evidence you observed as a government official, or are they products you developed to advance your post-government career? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Patel's voice was shaky. Representative, I stand by my testimony. Mr. Patel, Crockett said, her voice taking on the prosecutorial tone that had made her famous. Standing by your testimony isn't the same as providing evidence for it. She gathered her papers. Based on your own testimony today, you spent a year working closely with intelligence professionals and observed no evidence of the corruption you now claim is widespread. You made no reports, filed no complaints, and took no action to address problems you now say were obvious. She looked directly at him. The only thing that's obvious to me, Mr. Patel, is that you discovered these problems became much more profitable outside of government than inside it. The hearing room erupted. Republican senators objected to the characterization. Democratic senators looked stunned at the thoroughness of the dismantling. Reporters scrambled to capture every word, but Patel just sat there, looking like someone who had walked into an ambush he never saw coming. Chairman Graham tried to restore order. The gentleman from Texas will yield back. I yield back, Mr. Chairman, Crockett said calmly. But I'd like to submit Mr. Patel's financial disclosure forms for the record, along with contemporaneous NSC organizational charts showing his oversight responsibilities. As the hearing moved to the next questioner, the damage was already done. Within minutes, clips of Crockett's questioning were spreading across social media, not because she had been loud or theatrical, but because she had been methodical and devastating. She had done something that few politicians ever managed. She had taken down a witness not with gotcha questions or political theater, but with their own contradictions and financial incentives. The hearing continued for another hour, but everyone knew the real story. Patel, who had built a career on allegations of deep state corruption, had been exposed as someone who observed no such corruption when he was in a position to see it firsthand, and who only discovered these problems after he had books to sell and speeches to give. 3 weeks later, Patel quietly cancelled several upcoming speaking engagements and withdrew from consideration for a position with a conservative think tank. Crockett's approval ratings, meanwhile, soared among Democrats and earned grudging respect from some Republicans who appreciated her preparation and professionalism. Because in the end, the hearing had demonstrated something important about the nature of political accountability. The most effective oversight doesn't come from partisan attacks or conspiracy theories, but from careful preparation, attention to detail, and the willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads. Jasmine Crockett had shown that the best way to fight misinformation isn't with counter-narratives or political talking points. It's with facts, follow-up questions, and the kind of prosecutorial precision that leaves no room for evasion. And Kash Patel had learned that selling theories about government corruption is a lot easier than defending those theories under oath when someone has done their homework. If this story inspired you, if it reminded you that accountability matters more than ideology and facts matter more than theories, make sure to subscribe for more stories of people who prove that the most powerful political weapon isn't outrage or conspiracy. It's preparation and precision. Because sometimes the most important service you can provide to democracy is simply asking the right questions and demanding real answers.